Well, Hansens, it is time. Dear Evan Hansen, that almost was. Let's get into it. So, if you guys didn't know, Dear Evan Hansen, it's a movie. It's come out. It's gotten slaughtered by critics. Here's Dear Evan Hansen's head. This is the critics. Got absolutely obliterated, slaughtered. A lot of you guys probably don't know about the DC production of Dear Evan Hansen. And there was actually a full audio, legal bootleg. And I wanted to make this video for a long time, and I'm basically going to be going over the cut scenes, the cut dialogue, and some stuff that you fansins might not know about, and that I certainly didn't know about. So let's get into it. So the first thing up is that, so basically how this video is going to go is I'm going to explain and basically give you the cut songs and the cut scenes and give you an overview of the DC production. And then I'm going to give you my thoughts on how maybe they could do a revised Evan Hansen and taking, I think, stuff that the DC production did really well that the Broadway production maybe didn't. And for people that are very critical of the DC of the movie and the musical in general, I think the DC production will satisfy those people because it definitely gives more of a critical commentary on social media and how we exploit things and so forth. It's pretty much the same thing, but instead of does anybody have a map? Anybody have a map? It starts with This Could Be the Year, which is basically a much more upbeat song, and I think that it was good that they cut it because it kind of gave a weird textual tone where it was like it seemed like your traditional quirky musical, and then it went into I've learned to slam on the brake before I even turn the key. So then we get the big thing, A Little Bit of Light. Someone's made an animatic for you, probably have heard of it. And it basically is Cynthia, so it's basically a song where we know more about who Connor was as a real person. And we've seen that Connor is known as a freak or a psychopath. And Cynthia's mother tells about his past, how he too has been fighting anxiety. However, it's been at a very young age. And we get to see more descriptive stuff of how Connor was this really cool, fun kid. And then overnight he just changed. And she cherishes and loves that Evan was that little bit of light in Connor's world. And, yeah, it's pretty touching. What I like is that, Evan says a line where he says, we used to laugh all the time, and Cynthia says, he used to love jokes. And I think that's just one way of the way I interpret it, is that Evan and Connor are very similar, and we kind of already know who Connor is because he's so similar to Evan. And this song kind of confirms that. And, we really get to see how, we see this progression of seeing how he was a sweet little boy, and then he switched off the light and never came back. And the bigger part of it is that, there were moments, the bigger part of this song, and I'm going to read the lyrics, is he had moments with a little bit of light. In those moments, he had someone who was helping him to fight in the battle. He lost, he just couldn't win. But at least there were days when he let some light in, and in those moments, a little bit of light. And I think she was definitely referring to Evan, but I definitely do think she's also saying that there were little bits of light in Connor's life, and it's a very beautiful song. And I think this would appease people that were critical that we don't get to know who the real Connor is, and it would make them understand, oh, Connor and Evan were just two very similar people that went on two different paths. I think Connor had some stuff that he couldn't control, mental illness. So going on to the next scene, which was Requiem, which is pretty much the same, but it was more of a solo with Zoe, and then the parents joined in, and it was a lot longer, and it was orchestrated very differently. I'm glad that they changed it because personally I felt it to be a bit like draggy, and I think the ultimate version that they came up with was the best version of No Requiem. So in the Broadway production, Jared talks about how there'll be just like another third world country to raise money for, and it's funny. But in the DC production, we have Connor say a speech to Evan that is very, I think, harsh, but it gets the point of the show across so much better than anything in the Broadway production. So basically what Connor says is that the more terrible a tragedy is, the better, and people feel connected in that way. And how next week there'll be another terrible thing, another overdose that will connect people. And it kind of gives this harsher, more cynical, hard stance on my thesis of Dear Evan Hansen, which is that people want to feel connected and seen. Because of that, they, try and use death and tragedy to make them feel connected. And the whole point of Evan Hansen is to sympathize with those people. But I think to being critical of those actions and those people, and kind of telling it straight, I think would have helped benefit the show, because they really went there, and I feel like that's something that the detractors and the critics of the show would have appreciated. And the speech is just so much more impactful when Connor says it, because it's just, he's saying a factual thing, like a real thing that we have all gone through. Everyone is hitting on Ben Platt and being really mean to him, and we are basically connecting and coming together through hating on somebody, and we are basically doing something that the show is telling us that is negative. But I feel like the speech really hones in the idea and kind of just says factual information. He says it very straight and very hard, and I think that works so much better, and hopefully this makes sense. And I might actually play the audio so you can like interpret it in your own way, but I just think that this really hones in the idea of what Evan Hansen is about and makes the ideas more clear, and I just think that it gives that opposing side, because you can't have too much uplifting and empathy, and you can't have too much harsh and criticism of the people that are exploiting. You need to have a balance, and Evan Hansen, I feel like both in the movie and in the show, doesn't have a balance, and I think if they had a balance, people would have understood the show and the movie a lot better. I was just talking about how I wish they didn't cut Connor's lines to Evan. So after this scene, we get another scene which is not in any iteration, and that is Zoe basically reacting to Evan kissing her. And I wish they included the scene, because it is kind of odd that this doesn't get brought back up again, and then Zoe just magically kisses Evan. And she kind of says, grief makes us do really, like, weird things all the time. And so this scene wasn't, like, super important. There wasn't a lot to it, but it just resolved that thing that didn't get resolved in the Broadway show, and it always kind of bugged me. And so just from, like, a logical standpoint, it really made it work. Then we get into A Part of Me. This is on the deluxe album. Most of you guys have heard it by now. It's a beautifully haunting song that's basically a depressing version of You Will Be Found. And I think this number was so important. I kind of understand why they cut it, because You Will Be Found is about the positive aspects that Evan has on other people's lives, not just the Connors, and showing the good that the internet can be in terms of connecting people, bringing people together, opening up a conversation about mental illness, and showing that Evan does do terrible things, but he also does really good things, and so you're kind of in this, position, whereas You Will Be Found, whereas A Part of Me doesn't really go into those aspects. It more focuses on the Connors and dealing with how they feel, in very visceral, graphic lyrics that I think are very realistic to how parents deal with their tragedy. And the whole point and the message of this song being, you might, if you do die, whether by suicide or by just dying, you take a part away from me, and you take a part of me away. And it's that's so, it really hits you in the heart, and it really makes you think. And for anyone that's thinking of committing suicide or whatever, I think it just maybe brings things into logic for some of those people, or maybe will allow them to see the bigger repercussions that their deaths will have on other people. So I definitely do think that's one part of the message of the song. And again, it focuses more on character development as opposed to being an anthem and a very mainstream bop. And another great thing is that in the song, You Will Be Found is like, thank you, Evan Hansen, for connecting us. Whereas this is, I'll put in some of the clips, but as you have heard, some of the clips of the projections talking, saying Connor was my best friend, and people. There are two ways to interpret this. One is to say, oh, Connor did really have friends and people did care about him. But I come from the perspective of these people are kind of, it's weirdly not uplifting as much as it's kind of like you're saying, they're like, you guys didn't, like the kid that sat on the bus next to him didn't actually care enough to talk to him, or was too afraid to talk to him, or treated him unkindly. And these people are kind of lying just like Evan is, and so it really kind of becomes a critique on how we exploit tragedy for attention, for connection, and make this stuff up. And this happens in real life. But I think you need to balance that out as well. And I always say that Evan Hansen never has perfected balancing the two critiques and commentaries on social media, but you need to have both, and I feel, and not go into the uplifting too much, and that's what the movie and the musical does, I think. The You Are Not Alone, You Are Not Alone just sounds so haunting, and there's a comment that I always go back to where it's kind of mindless bots saying this, and it doesn't really mean anything. And for people that think it will be found as superficial and it's shallow, this I think is real tangible stuff, and I think it critiques that sensationalism, which should be critiqued, but I think we need to not criticize it and go into it too heavily and find a balance, because the whole point of the show is to empathize and understand, but not forgive people like Evan, which is a very hard thing to do, and to not see things in black and white, and not see people as heroes and villains, but see people as complicated people, and morally gray is, obviously not something that we want right now, but it is what it is. But Part of Me is a beautiful song, and I don't know where I heard this one, but when Evan kisses Zoe at the end, Connor's is just staring at them, and it's so haunting and creepy, and just kind of reminds the audience to not get lost in Evan's lie, which you want the audience to, but at the same time, you want them to keep an objective perspective so that everyone is aware of what's going on. And I think if people were more aware, and the audience felt like that, and the people that criticized Evan Hansen saw this number, they would, I think, be more forgiving of the show, and I think that this number would have really helped it in its image overall. But yeah, hopefully that made sense. And so basically the rest of the second act plays out how it did on Broadway. So the big change is where it's stuck together, buddy. Where basically Connor's speech about how Evan's saying that the only thing that could be left with is himself, and talking about how Zoe won't like Evan because it was a lie, is now put in before Good For You as opposed to after. And I think the reason why this works better is because essentially Evan realizes that more early on that in any other iteration, that what he's doing is wrong, and he tries to stop this, but then Connor reminds him is that, Zoe won't like you for you because you lied to her. Kind of saying how the lie keeps the family together, and kind of giving Evan reasons to keep the lie alive, but Evan ultimately rejects this, and then that goes into the scene of so Connor's scene kind of sets up the motivation, because we have another scene where after Evan has the whole fight with his mom and all that stuff, where he basically tries to step down from the Connor project. Evan says, like, I'm stepping down from the Connor project, I don't like the direction it's going in, and you see the Murphys being hurt, and Evan can't help but he doesn't like to see them hurt or have any negative emotions or feel anything. So he's motivated by that for a pure reason, for the first time since the first act, to then reveal the suicide note so that the orchard can get built, because he can't stand to see the Connors upset. And again, that's not a malicious that's not a malicious intention. That's not maliciously doing something to gain more. It's for a purely, simply good reason. Even though it's a flawed logic, to Evan it makes sense, and I think that just fits better with the character and my thesis of Evan as a character. Evan is also a lot meaner in this, I think, and I think that's almost needed, that you need to hate him more. You need to really see that he becomes something that he's not, and he panics because he's going to lose everything, and I think him panicking, that unleashes the meaner side in him, and we see Alana saying, like, when he says, I don't want to stop the orchard anymore, Alana's like, you got everything you ever wanted, and now you're done. And that's a great commentary on how we as a society use social media to promote Instagram stories about the elephants dying, and we'll talk about it and connect with it, and then we will forget about it, not do tangible things, not make money, and it's a cycle that continues. And I really wish they kept that line in, because I think it's much bigger than just relating to Evan. And I think as well that Evan just comes off a lot meaner in this. And I think that I'm glad they toned it down. But I also feel like if you tone it up, it almost kind of really allows you to be objective about the situation and see how kind of how much of a joke Evan is becoming, and kind of showing that character development, that on-character development, from really pure and simple and good intentions to now selfish and kind of being exploitative to then back to that. So it's a three transition, whereas in the Broadway production, it's more of like a two-stage where Evan kind of wants to keep the family, and he kind of acts out on other people, as opposed to this where he acts out, but he's also just becoming a different kind of person. And I think that was more complex and nuanced, ultimately. I like the Part of Me reprise when everyone's kind of hating on the Connors because they don't know the context of it, and the beautiful scoring of you left me blind, you left me dumb, and showing that, like, it's so easy to criticize, but we don't know what's actually going on, and how hurt the Connor family, or any family that we criticize for cancel culture on Twitter, actually feels. And words fail is very interesting because there are key things that are different. He says, words fail, there's nothing I could say. He repeats that multiple times. And I feel like that's more impactful because he I always felt like it was weird that he says there's nothing I can say, and then he starts saying stuff like, I wish this is everything I wanted. Well, he repeats that, and you can see that he's trying to actively think of something to say, and then he does find something, and I feel like that just made it more interesting and more of a journey in the song. Another thing is Cynthia says, you ate at our table, you slept in his bed, and Zoe's like, how could you let me love you? It's very sharp, hard things, but you get to see the rage and the anger and the conflict, and I feel like people wanted to see that more, whereas in the Broadway production, they just get very sad and emotional. And we need to, and I think by seeing their rage and kind of seeing it's more realistic, and it ultimately makes Words Fail less, like, you should feel bad for Evan, you should be emotional, but you should also be reminded of that. And I think getting constantly reminded is something that the show doesn't do now, and I feel like they should have kept that in there because it's very powerful and it hits you. It's like you really, like, Words Fail is kind of changes from just being Evan's song to being Evan and the Connors song and how they're reacting to it, and it just comes off as more realistic. And I think people that are critical of the show would like the way that the Words Fail played out here than on Broadway. And then the ending is pretty much the same. The monologue is a little bit different, but it's pretty much the same ending. But you kind of go away almost not liking Evan as much, and you're supposed to you almost can't understand and empathize with him as much because they tone him up to such a level. So at the end of the day, Dear Evan Hansen really should just find a neutral standing point where you can like empathize and understand with Evan, but also feel anger towards him, but not enough to overwhelm you to the point where you want to just completely annihilate him, because you shouldn't have the perspective of the Connors. You should see it from an objective but emotional, standpoint. So hopefully that whole thing made sense. But that was explaining the DC production. I think that this definitely answers a lot of the critical questions. I think people that are huge critics of the show would probably listen to this and say, why did you change a single thing from this? Because I think the DC production is the antidote for people that hate the musical. I still think people would find an issue with it, but I think people would say it's more realistic, it's much more deeper, it goes into more darker places, and it's ultimately a much more layered, nuanced, complex, interesting show, and it makes the Broadway production seem a bit more mainstream and toned down a little bit to fit a more commercial mold. Even though I don't think even Evan Hansen by itself is very commercial, but still, yeah. So, in conclusion, I think that Dear Evan Hansen, the DC production, is definitely the one that I think a lot of people that are critical of the show would love. And I think if you combine the elements of that, the Broadway production, and some of the movie stuff, and you can combine the whole thing, you might get a bit of an overstuffed show that's a bit meaty and maybe is a bit not as well paced, but I think you'd get something that would satisfy everybody. And I think that there was really good stuff you could take from all these things. And I was going to do something where I would kind of create my own version of Evan Hansen, but I kind of already explained how I would do that. And I think taking a part of me, some of the lines, and switching it to different characters, putting back in the scenes from the DC production, and balancing the uplifting and the commentary on sympathizing with very cancelable people, but also criticizing and rightly critiquing this sociopathic culture that we're cultivating through social media. And it's a very complex show. I still think the Broadway production is very well paced. I thought it was so well done, and I think that does it need to be fixed? No, but I think a revival 10 years down the line could definitely be in favor of getting some of the older material back into production. But guys, that's all I have for you guys today. Like, sub, and comment. I cannot wait to go see the Dear Evan Hansen movie tomorrow. My review will be coming out on Sunday, and I've got a bunch of Broadway content at the Tony Awards. I'm so excited, and thank you so much, especially all the people on Reddit, for getting me views and supporting my Dear Evan Hansen fascination and essays and my love for all things Broadway. I'm as happy as I can be in terms of making this kind of content, because this is what I love to talk about. And yeah, so peace.